The young and the restless spoilers. There was something about the kiss in Nice that refused to fade. Long after the flight home, long after the wound on Nick's side had closed and Sharon had gone back to her usual routines, that moment, when his hand reached for her, when her lips met his, lingered like a whisper neither could silence. It was born not just of impulse, but of years layered with sorrow, warmth, misunderstanding, and longing. It was the kind of kiss that stripped away every wall they had spent years carefully erecting, a kiss born not out of new love, but of old truths resurfacing with unbearable gravity. And yet, as soon as the wheels of the plane touched down in Genoa City, Nick did what Nick always did, he compartmentalized. The memory became something fragile, tucked away in the back of his mind behind doors sealed by guilt, fear, and his unrelenting desire not to ruin the delicate peace he'd carved with Sharon through co-parenting and years of emotional détente. Sharon, on the other hand, felt a deep unrest growing inside her. The kiss hadn't been nothing. It hadn't been a product of adrenaline or nostalgia. It had been real. He had pulled her in, not with the reckless hunger of a man lost in grief, but with the quiet vulnerability of someone reaching for home. That home, for her, had always been Nick, a flawed, difficult, infuriating Nick. And yet, now back on familiar ground, Sharon found herself walking on eggshells, unsure when or how to even bring up what had happened without making it seem like she wanted something more. The last thing she wanted was to push him away, but the silence was already doing exactly that. Every shared glance became awkward, every brush of fingers strained with tension, every conversation clipped before it could drift toward anything personal. But of course, in Genoa City, nothing stays quiet forever. Secrets, tension, chemistry, they draw predators. And Phyllis could sense it from the moment she caught Sharon alone at Crimson Lights, looking dazed, distracted, lips parted as if still caught in a kiss that refused to fade. Phyllis didn't need confirmation, she knew the look. She had seen it before, in the mirror, after Nick had broken down years ago and turned to her in a whirlwind of regret and lust. History may not always repeat itself, but it does echo, and for Phyllis, the reverberation was clear. Something had happened between Nick and Sharon, and whatever it was, it could crack the thin ice Sharon stood on. And if there was one thing Phyllis had mastered, it was knowing exactly when and how to stomp. Her approach wasn't overt, Phyllis knew better than to confront Nick directly. He'd deny it, deflect it, twist it into a lecture about boundaries. No, her plan was subtler. She started by getting closer to him again under the pretense of concern. He was recovering from a stabbing, after all. What kind of ex-girlfriend, what kind of friend, would she be if she didn't check in? At first, it was harmless. A lunch. A few jokes about how dull life had gotten. Then came the dinner invitation. Then the wine. She didn't try to kiss him. Not yet. She let him feel comfortable again, feel understood. Sharon, she subtly suggested, was still stuck in the past. And wasn't it telling that Nick hadn't even told her about the full extent of his trauma until Phyllis asked the right questions? Nick, of course, was trying desperately to stay neutral. He cared about Phyllis, always had, in some twisted way. But he wasn't blind to her games. What rattled him more was his own reaction. Why had he gone so quiet when Sharon brought up the kiss? Why had he felt a rush of shame instead of excitement? Was it because the moment meant more than he was ready to admit, or because he feared what it would mean if he did? His life had already been gutted once by chasing lost love. He had no stomach left for heartbreak, and yet no clarity on what his heart even wanted anymore. One part of him burned to go back to that moment in Nice, rewind time, and let the kiss become more. The other part, the fearful, parental, fractured part, screamed for caution. Meanwhile, Sharon was beginning to unravel. It was in the way she checked her phone, hoping for a message that never came. In the way she looked through old photos, trying to decipher which version of Nick had been real, the man in Nice, or the one back home pretending it didn't happen. She tried to throw herself into her work, into Mariah's life, into anything that didn't make her feel like she was waiting for someone who had already turned away. But the truth clawed its way in. She was in love with Nick again. Maybe she always had been. And he was slipping through her fingers without even telling her why. And then came the moment that changed everything. It happened at the Grand Phoenix. A party, a fundraiser, another excuse for the town's elite to drink champagne and smile over past sins. Sharon arrived late. She hadn't planned to go, but something told her she needed to. Nick was there. So was Phyllis. And when Sharon saw them, tucked into a corner booth, leaning too close, laughing too much, it wasn't rage that struck her first. It was nausea. She could feel the betrayal in her bones before it had even happened. Phyllis wasn't just circling, she was devouring. And Nick, for all his usual wariness, looked like a man letting go. Whether it was to distract himself from what he really wanted or because he couldn't bear to face it, he was letting Phyllis back in. The next morning, Sharon didn't go to work. She didn't return calls. She sat alone in her living room, staring at nothing. She thought of the kiss. Of the silence. Of the way Nick had once told her, long ago, that she was the only one who ever really knew him. And now, he was letting himself be known by someone else again. That wasn't the part that hurt. It was the fact that she had risked her heart, and he hadn't even noticed. Or worse, he had, and didn't care. Phyllis, of course, didn't stop there. She made sure Sharon heard about their evening. How intimate the conversation had been. How Nick had opened up. She didn't lie, she didn't need to. The truth, filtered through just enough implication, was more powerful than fiction. Sharon, she claimed, had had her chance. And she blew it. That's what happens when you live in the past. Phyllis wasn't just inserting herself into the cracks. She was splitting them open wider, making sure Sharon couldn't crawl back through them even if she tried. But what Phyllis didn't account for was the depth of Nick's guilt. He hadn't kissed Phyllis. Not yet. But he had let her in, and in doing so, betrayed something that had been quietly blooming inside him, a second chance with Sharon. And guilt, when it curdles into clarity, can be powerful. One morning, long after Phyllis had started making assumptions and Sharon had begun closing her doors, Nick found himself standing outside Sharon's house. He didn't knock. He just stood there, unsure of what to say. The truth was he didn't know how to fix what he'd broken, or if it could even be fixed. What happens next will depend on who has the strength to speak first. On whether Sharon chooses to shield herself from more pain or risks her heart again. On whether Nick stops running from the one thing he's always claimed to want, real love. And on whether Phyllis, master of chaos, is satisfied with her victory or decides to burn it all down once more. Because in the young and the restless, love isn't just a feeling. It's a battlefield, and Sharon, Nick, and Phyllis are each armed with history, hurt, and hope. Who fires the next shot may decide whether the past is truly past, or if some stories were never meant to end. Not in Nice, not in Genoa City, and not even after the final kiss. Let me know if you'd like a continuation, a rewrite with more tension, or even a version told from Phyllis's point of view. I'm happy to keep expanding it. There was no more denying it. The kiss in Nice had been a beginning, not a mistake. And though both Nick and Sharon had spent weeks tiptoeing around what it meant, avoiding it in glances, swallowing it in silence, it returned every time their fingers brushed or their words lingered too long. There was no unkissing what had happened in that moment, and now, with Nick struggling under the weight of everything he had endured, the attack, the house arrest, the chaos of recent months, he found himself seeking refuge in the one place that had always felt like home. Sharon. It didn't start with seduction. It began with a walk. A late-night talk outside the GCAC after a long, emotionally exhausting day. Sharon had convinced him to eat something, to get out of his head, just for a little while. And when he looked at her in the moonlight, all those years seemed to fall away, the marriages, the betrayals, the children, the losses. All that remained were two people who had always been caught in each other's orbit, drawn together by something deeper than passion or duty, something like fate. So when she reached out and placed her hand on his chest, and he leaned forward with that haunted vulnerability she remembered all too well, it wasn't a question of if. It was already happening. There was no resisting it. And neither of them wanted to. They didn't want the past. They wanted this moment. A fragile, suspended breath of something real, something just theirs. The room was quiet, dim, cloaked in soft amber light and whispered memories. Nick's touch was reverent, trembling, almost afraid. Sharon's hands shook as she reached for him, as if she were afraid this too might disappear. They kissed again, but this time it wasn't a stolen spark in a foreign city. This time it burned like confession, like coming home. When they finally fell into bed together, it wasn't rushed or impulsive. It was inevitable. Like tides pulling back toward the shore. But in Genoa City, nothing stays sacred for long. Phyllis wasn't looking to cause trouble, not that night. Not explicitly. She had received a message earlier that day, a cryptic one from Summer that said Nick seemed off, that he had been seen at the GCAC with Sharon, and that maybe someone should check in. It had all the innocent wrapping of concern, but Phyllis had known Summer too long to miss the subtext. Whatever was happening, she was already too late. And yet she couldn't stop herself. She told herself she was just looking out for Nick. That it was nothing. But the way her pulse quickened in the elevator told a different story. She knew. She knew even before she knocked on the door. She knew by the silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of breathless energy. And when the door cracked open slightly, not locked, not latched, just careless in the haze of lust. That's when her stomach dropped. She stepped inside, calling his name softly, as if maybe she'd misread everything. But the sound that met her ears told her otherwise, the kind of sound that makes the ground fall out beneath you. And then she saw them. They were tangled together in the sheets, bodies pressed close, eyes closed, lips murmuring unspeakable things. Sharon's face was turned toward Nick's chest, and Nick looked peaceful in a way she hadn't seen in years. That peace shattered the moment he opened his eyes and saw her. Time froze. Sharon sat up first, the sheet wrapped hastily around her, shock breaking through her haze. Nick followed, his face pale and wide-eyed. And Phyllis just stood there. No fury. No sarcasm. Just devastation, pure and brittle. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She only laughed, once, a cold, joyless sound that cut through the air like a blade. Well, she whispered, eyes burning, I guess I finally got my answer. Nick scrambled to say something, anything, but there was nothing that would undo what she saw. Nothing that could reframe it, soften it, excuse it. Not when the look on Sharon's face wasn't guilt, but love. Not when the room smelled like memory and desire and something Phyllis had lost a long time ago but hadn't admitted until now. The door slammed behind her before either of them could find words. What was supposed to be a moment of healing, of rebirth, had now been tainted. Sharon sat in silence, pulling the sheet tighter around her body, as if it could protect her from the fallout. Nick sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He didn't regret what had happened. Not in his heart. But he regretted how it ended, how it had once again caused more pain than peace. And worse, he knew that Phyllis wouldn't keep this to herself. That single moment had lit the match. By morning, the news had already begun to trickle through the corridors of Genoa City. Summer said nothing, but her eyes were glassy when she passed her father in the hallway. Noah barely looked up when Sharon tried to speak to him. Mariah, sharp-tongued and loyal, demanded to know what Sharon had been thinking. And Victor, hearing it from someone, probably Phyllis, merely raised an eyebrow and muttered that history always repeats itself when the lesson isn't learned. And what was the lesson? That love, no matter how deep, is always vulnerable to exposure. That Sharon and Nick, no matter how many times they found each other again, would never be free of the collateral damage they caused. That Phyllis, ever the wild card, could turn one mistake into a war. The question now was whether shit could survive this latest blow. Not just the sex, not just the intrusion, but the way their moment, had been stolen from them. Because love isn't just about desire. It's about timing. About safety. About trust. And Nick wasn't sure if Sharon still felt safe now. Sharon wasn't sure if she could stand in the spotlight again and watch their love be dissected, mocked, ruined. But one thing was clear, the silence was no longer an option. They had made a choice. They had crossed a line. And now the world. And Phyllis would respond. The next time Nick saw Phyllis, she didn't scream. She didn't throw a drink. She simply smiled, that dangerous, glittering smile that meant she was already planning her next move. And he knew what she was capable of. She had destroyed reputations with a whisper. Torn down marriages with a phone call. And now, wounded and furious, she was coming for him. Or worse, for Sharon. And yet, despite the storm brewing, Sharon found herself calmer than expected. Because even though the moment had been ruined, the truth had not. She loved Nick. And for once, she wasn't going to run from it. If Phyllis wanted a war, Sharon was done hiding. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing. And Sharon had chosen Nick. Again. Maybe for the last time. But she had chosen him. The only question left was whether Nick would choose her back, not in secret, not in a hotel room, but in the light of day, with all of Genoa City watching. Because sometimes, survival isn't about hiding from the fire. It's about walking straight through it, hand in hand, and daring it to burn you alive.